Remedy Entertainment. Of all the companies you could conjure to mind that would be well suited to create a provocative, dark and ponderous psychological horror experience, the creators of the Max Payne series would be unlikely to be high on the list. They made their name coining the bullet time mechanic and creating one of the most iconic, tortured action heroes of the modern era. But Alan Wake proves that, unlike many of their peers, they're not afraid to try something new, even if it doesn't necessarily work 100% of the time. First announced in 2005, Alan Wake began life in much the same way as it ultimately released, a broody and melancholic exploration of a Stephen King-style city, framed by a narrative about a narrative. It took 5 years and a direction change or two for the finished product to be revealed, and when I got my hands on it, I found that the earlier renderings of a monochromatic, slow and methodical journey had been replaced by an equally contemplative tale of intrigue and mystery, wrapped around a spire of depression and tortured guilt, overwhelmed by a blue filter. Since I was already hyped about this game, having followed it from its humble beginnings to the moment of its release, I picked up on the change with muted enthusiasm. It was all looking a little desaturated, and don't get me wrong, horror's heart seems to cling to black and white, or at least a fundamental lack of colour 9 times out of 10. But being a horror game doesn't necessitate that the world suddenly lose all of its hue. Little did I know that instead of just being a cheap horror gimmick, the filter was quite deliberate. Alan Wake isn't really a horror game, at least not to me. For the purpose of genres and labels, it is considered a psychological horror game, and whilst I'll agree with the former, I wouldn't stretch so far as to say it's horrifying. It isn't really scary unless you start to think too much about its plot, but it is unnerving. It doesn't rely on cheap jump scares for the most part, or violent violin shrieks, but it does have an intense atmosphere, albeit one it isn't always consistent with. It features some of the most haunting, chilling music I have ever had the pleasure of listening to, and though steeped in a heavy blanket of paid dues towards King and Twilight Zone, and being bereft of the kind of rich and forlorn detail I enjoy from Silent Hill and Eternal Darkness, Alan Wake is, and remains to this day, an unforgettable experience. It's important to understand that whilst effective as a psychological experiment, Alan Wake is not really a brilliant game. It has a great story with one of the strangest and yet simultaneously slick and rewarding narrative structures of any game I've ever come across, but mechanically it falls a little flat. There are innumerable moments of controller-breaking frustration throughout this game, casually stumbling into an obvious setup for any other game's boss arena, and finding yourself staring down a possessed farming vehicle whose hitbox seems to be twice its size. Innocently taking a single step off the beaten forest path, and being pelted with axes for your trouble. Facing a roaring horde of sodding shadow birds who seem to surge from everywhere and nowhere all at once. This game should have come bundled with a crow-shaped stress ball. You find yourself in the shoes of the titular Alan Wake, a best-selling author stricken with writer's block, whose wife, Alice, brings him to an isolated cabin out in the middle of nowhere, under the pretense of a holiday, in an effort to help him write again. Frustrated, Alan shouts her down and storms away, only for the cabin to be plunged into darkness, his nyctophobic wife left screaming inside. Although Alan hurries inside to rescue her, he finds no trace of Alice but a ripple in the lake. Without pause for thought, Alan dives beneath the waves. Alan Wake becomes a surreal and dreamlike, or rather nightmare-esque portrayal of a desperate man struggling with growing irrationality and fear as he tries to uncover the secrets of the town of Bright Falls and his wife's disappearance. It begins with curiosities, the ethereal image of a man in an ancient diver's suit, a page of an unwritten novel distinctly by Alan's hand yet unknown to his memory laid on the road before him, sidelong glances and plastic glassy-eyed stares from the townsfolk, a strange and elderly woman garbed as if in death itself, whispering from the shadows. By all accounts, Alan Wake wears its psychological horror badge proudly upon its sleeve. It isn't subtle in its efforts, but its delivery is certainly one of the most interesting and immersive deliveries in recent memory. Throughout the game you will stumble across pages from a novel entitled Departure, a novel almost certainly written by Alan, but one he has no memory of writing. The novel pages foretell the events of the game, sometimes hours in advance, but primarily they foreshadow events that are soon to take place. Well, you might think, how foolish. How can there be any mystery to the game if you know what's going to happen at any given moment? But that's just it, you don't. The game gives you an idea of what's about to happen, but it doesn't throw its plot out of the window and tell you to just go with the flow. You won't always find the pages, you won't always know if what is happening to you is planned, pre-written or predetermined. You know bits and pieces of the story, just like Alan himself. But the story you are being told is the story you are writing for yourself. You are enabling a self-fulfilling prophecy as you wander through the fog, aided only by your torch and your doubt. Alan, on the other hand, has bits and pieces of a different story, his wife's disappearance. His agency and the player's agency work in tandem as often as they work at odds. At times it feels as though you're being railroaded along a particular path. Other times it feels thoroughly maddening as Alan deliberately walks into a situation you already know is perilous without thought or preparation. And there is a reason for this. A beautiful, gloriously smart reason that I will get into shortly. This is your first spoiler warning. As I mentioned previously, mechanically this game is on the clunky side. Alan feels heavy, stiff and awkward to control, and at times it can feel as though he is deliberately fighting against your inputs. On occasion, a dodge that felt well timed will still end with you taking an axe to the face, whereas other times you will matrix your way through an entire area without ever having to stop to take a breather. You have a handful of weapons at your disposal, primarily your handgun, shotgun and rifle, but the core element of the game, and the aspect that gained the most attention, is its use of light. Your torch is your invaluable companion throughout the entirety of this game. The enemies you come across, whether human, animal or object, are possessed by an entity known as the Dark Presence, and can only be destroyed by illuminating them. For human enemies, once you've stripped away the shadows enveloping them, you can empty a handful of rounds in to finish them off or sprint away, though it's advisable to stick to the former since enemies tend to be much faster than you and have incredible pinpoint accuracy. The game is also littered with flares that can destroy most basic enemies with a single shot, and checkpoints are reasonably frequent, indicated by pools of light that will regenerate your health for as long as you stand within them. Areas also tend to have lights that you can activate for brief periods of time, which you can stand behind and wait for an enemy to stumble by, before switching them on and destroying them. But as lazy as it sounds, I don't really want to harp on about the mechanics for too long because they are by far the least interesting aspect of this game. In fact, what I detailed just now is pretty much the gameplay in its entirety. For the most part, you'll be moving from point A to point B, occasionally collecting keys or turning on circuit breakers. There's very little to it beyond that, and sadly that does the game a bit of an injustice. The mechanics and the gameplay in general are a vessel through which the game delivers its narrative, and it is a narrative that deserves a much better mechanical framework. There are parts of this game that feel miserably unfair. Enemies you couldn't possibly have known were there, enemies with enormous hitboxes and particularly ridiculous encounters with possessed machinery that is, to be honest, ludicrous and a little out of place. It's all intended to give off the feeling that although you are conforming to the story you find scattered about the place, something is off. NPCs are often strangely rigid, plastic-faced and glassy-eyed, partly deliberate and partly an accidental result of the majority of the expression and graphical fidelity being given to the game's environments and atmosphere. Everything has an unnatural hue to it and the world doesn't feel quite right. Why is the town trying to kill you? Aren't you giving it exactly what it wants? Aren't you following the story laid out before you? Why aren't you just taking a leisurely stroll through Paradise City? And this is exactly why this game deserves so much more. The frustrating gameplay and mismatch between its absorbing plot and its stressful difficulty curves make experiencing the narrative a much less enjoyable experience. The game can be a nightmare even on the easiest difficulty setting. Bullets are scarce and encourage you to time your shots until the enemy's close enough that a single shell will knock them flat. But if you are interrupted mid-trigger pull, you will take a lot of damage. Relatively speaking, it's all balanced reasonably well, but the mechanics' downsides can absolutely put people off and I would not blame them at all. This is a failing I've mentioned of a few games recently, most notably The Evil Within. Games with strong and genuinely engaging narratives are largely focusing on their written craft with less attention given to the way they actually feel to play, and the way Alan Wake feels to play is far less interesting than the way it actually unfolds before you. It's damning, and everything I've just said is certainly so. But even so, with influences such as Stephen King, The Shining, Twin Peaks and Twilight Zone, I would expect a theatrical, dark and dramatic narrative worthy of its own printed novel. And that is exactly what Alan Wake presents. Using 3 key themes, it wraps its central premise around a brittle gameplay shell and fleshes it out with a wonderfully written plot. Those key themes are the aforementioned light, the shaky, shimmering dream towards which Alan strives, darkness, the presence always a single step behind, and music. This game's music is sublime. I've already said that it has a haunting soundtrack, but that's only half of the story. The game also uses licensed music ranging from Bowie to Nick Cave, which serve to set the narrative tone for each of the game's sections. Alan Wake is divided into TV-style episodes from a time before it was the most overused trope in gaming history, and each licensed track features during the credits of the episode, serving to evoke a variety of emotions in the player in anticipation of the next chapter. The licensed music is the biggest reason I forgive a lot of this game's flaws, for one very specific reason. Back in 2003, Remedy Entertainment's creative director, Sam Lake, took a friend of his to one side and asked him to create a song for their new game, based on a poem that Sam had written. That song was the catalyst to the formation of my all-time favourite band. The song was Late Goodbye, the game was Max Payne 2, and the band was Poets of the Fall. Have you ever had a moment where you saw or heard something in a game that made you stop and really pay attention? Perhaps hearing Sif's theme for the first time in Dark Souls, or walking up to the shard in the original Mirror's Edge, or perhaps the opening scene of Mass Effect 2, something that stops you in your tracks and really takes your breath away. For me, that moment was an innocent little radio in Alan Wake. As I entered a warehouse in the game's 5th chapter, one of the game's many radios, which previously had only played fun or curious interviews with its host or pieces of music I hadn't really paid much attention to, began to play a song. A gentle, sweeping piece of guitar music, a piece of music that grabbed my attention and held it steadfastly for its entire 5-minute runtime. The song in question is War, from Poets of the Fall's 4th album, Twilight Theatre. It was the first song I had ever heard by the band, having never played the Max Payne games, and I distinctly remember that first moment walking into the warehouse and hearing that piece of music slowly rise in vigour and expression. I don't mean to sound as though I'm plugging a really, really underrated band, but sod it, I am. You should go and listen to Poets of the Fall if you like that kind of music. Specifically, you should listen to War, and you should watch the video for Carnival of Rust. I won't harp on any longer, but that should give you a good idea of why this game is quite special to me. This is your final spoiler warning. I spoke before of how the narrative raises a lot of questions that wrap themselves wonderfully around strange curiosities. Why am I being punished for doing what the game wants me to do? The reason is simple. Alan has written this novel, yes, but he's not written it for the purposes that it should have been written for. Let me explain. By following the path he has laid out for himself, you are in fact deviating from the path your enemy wants you to follow. The game's antagonist is the aforementioned dark presence, an entity born of malice from within the very lake Alan's wife fell into. Alleged to be naught but a legend, the dark presence was born when a beloved poet, Tom, lost his wife to the depths of the lake and desperately tried to write her back into existence. In his foolish hubris, he created a malevolent entity instead, the dark presence of the lake, wearing the face of his loved one. In an effort to destroy his creation, Tom tried to trap the dark presence in the lake and failed. And as you have by now guessed, Alan has unwittingly unleashed this presence once more. Alan is trapped in the cabin beneath the lake, forced into writing the dark presence free of its watery grave, but there is some small part of him that knows what is happening, and so he begins to write a story in which Alan escapes the lake, frees the town of the Dark Presence's hold and selflessly sacrifices himself to bring his wife back from the depths. Alan's conscious body may be trapped, but his subconscious writes himself into the story that should be the Dark Presence's liberation. Alan Wake, the character whose motivations we have struggled to comprehend throughout the entire game, and whose fate we are beginning to understand, is given the chance to atone for the foolish mistake he made, for the sins he committed that drowned his wife. Far back at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that the game wears a peculiar blue filter throughout the majority of its runtime, with the only real exception being the very beginning chapter when you arrive in Bright Falls for the first time. As it transpires, this serves to underline the fact that the world is really not as it seems, which we can hazard a healthy guess at 10 minutes into the game, but still. Rather, that filter represents the ocean itself, blanketed across the bright falls of Alan's imagination. The world is cold and dead because the story he is writing is lifeless and heartless, a world created for the sole purpose of, at first, freeing the Dark Presence. As the game proceeds, however, more and more light is brought into the fold, culminating in the meeting in this glorious room. As Alan becomes more aware of the situation he is trapped within, the world begins to brim with life and energy, and the odds which had previously been stacked against you slowly turn in your favour. The game's lighting and stark, contrasting colours deliver a subtly understated and oppressive weight to the entire experience. Everything feels heavy and haunted. Even when you're alone, you can never quite shake the feeling that there are eyes and ears at every corner, waiting for the right moment to take you by surprise. The Dark Presence is everywhere, and it is waiting for its opportunity to break free. This game's story is masterfully told. Like Silent Hill before it, so much of the tension and emotion of the game is dependent upon the atmosphere, and if you're not drawn in by its story, you won't enjoy the way the entire world is drenched in a curtain of blue and black. In all honesty, what I have said does not even remotely do justice to it. There are many interpretations to the story and many more ways to ignore its subtleties and shadowy whispers, and instead consider it a straightforward light against dark story. But that is not the case, not at all. In fact, to strip away the importance of the game's subtle mastery is to belittle it entirely. I won't lie. Alan Wake is frustrating. As a game, it is average at best. The mechanics are far too simple and the gameplay is often tedious and frustrating. It has aged reasonably well in terms of its appearance, but its atmosphere and experience relies heavily upon your investment in the story. Don't care about the narrative, you won't care about the rest of the game. I didn't set out to review this game as such when I started writing this script. I wanted instead to highlight what I feel is one of the strongest narratives of the previous generation. If you have never played this game, I urge you to give it a shot, even if it's just to experience the story for yourself, and come away bewildered, impressed, or perhaps on that fabled middle ground I've heard exists. The nature of interpretation and the emotive provocativeness that games as a medium are capable of achieving is a topic I love to discuss, and I would like to know what you thought of Alan Wake. Did you like it? Did you hate it? How did you interpret it? Did you interpret it at all? Interpretations independent of the author's intent have become a core part of gaming culture, with titles like Limbo, Inside, The Witness, the Soul series and many others evoking a community that so often seems founded on picking apart the tiniest of details and revelling in the intrigue and mystery. There are ripples in the waters where the stones begin to fall, and video games have moved on from their humble beginnings to theatrical and cinematic masterpieces, amongst other less savoury descriptions. Video games are now asking you to do something that would have been unthinkable 30 years ago. Cast a stone into the water and see where the ripples lead. After all, it's not a lake.
It's an ocean.
Alan, wake up.
Hello everyone and welcome to my post-video ramble. I'm going to try and keep this short and sweet. It's just a very quick message to say, first of all, thank you everybody for the support. It really, really means a lot to me. I'm not going to ramble too much because I think I put that in the comments quite a lot when I reply to people. I do like replying to people. If you want to ask me a question, if you've got any comments, any constructive criticism, anything like that, do let me know. Do pop a comment in the box below and I will get back to you. I want to apologise for the incredibly wonky schedule that I've got. I do work a full-time job and it's sometimes, after a long day, it's very difficult to work up the motivation. But I absolutely want to pour as much time and effort as I can into making videos, especially about the games that I love. I made some promises at the start of this year about a bunch of games in my Taste of Things to Come video. A bunch of games that I want to make videos on. I've got recorded footage for pretty much all of the games. The only thing that's holding me back is that my capture card no longer works properly when I plug it in to my PlayStation or what have you, and then plug it into my computer. It crashes my computer. It gives my computer a blue screen of death every single time, and I've tried uninstalling and reinstalling, updating everything. I have absolutely no idea what to do to fix it. So if anybody's heard of this, literally I can load up the software and it won't find the capture card, it won't find any signal, and then if I close the software, or even if I leave it running about 20 seconds after I've plugged it in, it crashes my computer and I have to restart everything. It's really annoying. So if anyone's heard of anything like that and you've got any fixes, let me know. Otherwise I'm going to have to save up to buy a laptop before I can start reviewing console games again. Anyway, regardless, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed my video, let me know in the comments below. I'd really appreciate if you guys think of someone who might enjoy my videos. Pop them a message, be like, hey, this weird English person wants you to listen to her ramble about video games she likes. I'm also really conscious of the fact that I'm talking really quickly at the moment. It's a little late at night and I'm trying to get this done and not be too loud at the same time because the walls are very thin between me and my neighbours and they probably think I'm a real weirdo. Anyway guys, thank you for watching, thank you for listening to me ramble. If you got this far, good on you. I much appreciate everything that everyone's done, everything that everyone's told me. I'm trying to make my content better all the time and I can't do that without you guys, so thank you very much indeed. You guys have yourselves a lovely week. Thank you. The song in question is War from Poets of the Album's Fourth Fall.